Yesterday, we have given a sketchy presentation of the philosophy of Karol Wojtyła. I try to give a summary. A philosophy of subjectivity that is not a subjectivist philosophy. The modern age discovers man, the subject, wants philosophers to begin with the subject and not with the object. And this contains something that is extremely important, because subjects are more interesting than objects. And what is necessary for our life stands much more in our relations to other subjects than to our relations with objects. So the discovery of subjectivity, the centrality of subjectivity, is a great acquisition of modernity. Modernity, nevertheless, runs the risk of immediately losing this great cognitive advantage, because the subject modernity discovers is a subject that has no objective structure. And then the subject coincides with what the subject thinks of himself. Every one of you knows, especially when you fall in love. I imagine many of you are just in the age in which one falls in love, no? And I imagine all of you know that each one of us thinks about himself, has ideas about himself. Nevertheless, what we really are is not what we think about ourselves. And when we fall in love, the person, if this love is not superficial, it is consolidates in a true love, then the beloved person allows us to see the truth about ourselves. That is not what we had thought before that we are. It's not our imagination about ourselves. There is a false ego and a true ego. And the philosophy of Wojtyła tries to give us the possibility of making philosophy with this true ego. And he puts together being, the beginning of St. Thomas Aquinas, primo quod calit in intentione stans, being a starting point, with the subject, cogito ergo sum, starting with the true human being who is at the same time an object and a subject. The fact that I am a subject and an object at the same time is reflected in the structure of my consciousness. In my consciousness, I have my subjectivity, I have a way of seeing the world and a way of receiving the world. To receive the world, it means I know. There is an objective knowledge about myself and also about others. But at the same time, this objective knowledge that is given has to become subjective. I must subjectively appropriate the objective reality. That's also a common experience. Sometimes it is difficult for us to accept reality. We know that something's true, but we do not succeed in accepting this as our truth. Let's go back again to the fundamental experience of falling in love. It reveals us something about ourselves, but in order for a superficial sentiment to become a true love, I must accept, interiorize the truth that I discover. And it may happen that I don't, or that I do it in a way that is only imperfect. In this way, each one of us creates his own subjective world, his personality. We are persons. The person is a substance, is an object, but we have also a personality, the way in which we develop our personhood. We have this as individuals, we have this as communities. So you have a Czech culture, that is the way in which the Czech people through history has appropriated the fundamental truth about the human being and has created a system to educate the people to these truths. And it is not the same to learn these truths through Czech history or to learn them through Italian history or to learn them through, I don't know, Birmanian history or any other kind of history. The truth of a man is one. The ways through which we interiorize these truths are different. So you have the reality of cultures and of nations. The approach of Wojtyła allows us to develop a philosophy of culture. Why do I say this in a class that is supposed to tell you something about Pope Francis? There are good reasons. I want to begin my exposition on Pope Francis, again with Wojtyła, but now not with the philosopher, with the Pope. The first thing Wojtyła does when he is elected is to take an airplane and fly to Latin America. Well, not exactly the same, but the first important thing, let us say, the first important thing is that he does is to take a plane and to fly to Latin America. And he goes to Puebla in Mexico. In Mexico, there is the third General Conference of the Latin American Episcopate, the CELAM. He goes there. And he delivers a series of homilies and speeches that constitute a kind of, let us say, a regional encyclical. They are so important, so dense of meaning as an encyclical. Nevertheless, it is a kind of encyclical taught for Latin America. On another occasion, perhaps we will explain how is it possible that this Polish man, a few weeks after having been elected Pope, already has the capacity of giving such a precise judgment on Latin America as it is contained in these homilies and speeches. But that would be too much for today. What does he say? This third conference of the Latin American Episcopate had been convocated fundamentally to come to grips, to come to terms with the phenomenon of the theology of liberation. Between 1968, even a little bit before 1960, in the 60s, let us say, in the 60s, but especially between 1968 and 1979, you have a tremendous theological development in Latin America. In the center of this development stands the theology of liberation. 1968 is the second General Conference of Latin American Episcopate. And after 11 years, you have the second conference, the third conference. The second conference was in Medellin. I imagine that some of you at least have heard the echo of the Bishops' Conference of Medellin. What shall we do with the liberation theology? First of all, what is liberation theology? Liberation theology has fundamentally two sides. The first side is exemplified in a very important article of a Jesuit, Father Lima Vaz. He was a Brazilian. And he says, this article is one of the main sources, and this is a point that all liberation theologians accept. Up to now, since the discovery of America until the 60s of the 20th century, we have developed a theology that was a reflex theology for a reflex church. A reflex church is a church that preaches the gospel, making use of categories that are imitated from another church. It is the same when we are children. In the beginning, we repeat what we have heard from our parents. Later, when we grow up, perhaps we will say the same things, but we will say those things not on the basis of what has been told us by our parents, but on the basis of the human experience that we have acquired. I have put to test those things, and I have seen that they are true. And of course, I have seen that they are true, but I have also subjectivized them. I've made of them a part of my individual world of values. And so I shall tell them not exactly in the same way in which my father told them to me. Let us take one fundamental value, the value of femininity. I have a wife, and I have a mother. The femininity of my wife is the same as that of my mother, but it is also completely different. The core is the same, but the cultural manifestation of this core is different. And my daughters, oh, of course, they are women just like their mother, and they have the same culture of their mother. Nevertheless, they are completely different from their mother. And what shall I say about my granddaughters? Even another word, the same and at the same time different. You remember, yesterday we commented upon Borges, el otro, el mismo. Now, we have to think the event of the faith, not copying European theologians, but beginning with the experience of faith of the Latin American people. We need a Latin American theology. That is the first pillar of liberation theology, and we owe this pillar to Enrique Lima Vaz, a great Brazilian and Jesuit theologian. On this point, in one sense, everybody agrees. After Medellin, this is the common task of Latin American theology. All Latin American theology accept this task and are engaged with this task. If we try to think the faith, beginning with the faith experience of the Latin American people, then we immediately encounter a series of problems. The first problem is a methodological problem. Does a Latin American Jesus exist? Is it not true that the event of Jesus Christ is only one? And it happened in Palestine, more or less 2,000 years ago, and the church has the task of transmitting faithfully this event to all generations and to all nations of the earth. How can we have a Latin American theology if there is only one Christ? The answer is simple, and it is not new. The event of Jesus Christ happened once and forever, but it happens again. In each Christian community, every time when we celebrate the Mass, the event of the beginning happens again. And if the Catholic truth is one, nevertheless, the way to appropriate this truth, the way to interiorize this truth, are many. And different peoples have different ways to appropriate the same fundamental truth. I quoted yesterday Anselm von Balthasar. I already talked about the idea of religious style. There are different styles that express all the Catholic truth, nevertheless from a specific point of view. We have ecclesiastical styles, we have lay styles, we have masculine styles, we have feminine styles, and we have also national styles or continental styles. We have styles that are linked to a rite, and we have so many styles. So what is the Latin American style? Shall we develop a Latin American style? How? We can do this only reflecting on Latin American history. And theology must move between these two extremes. It's a tension. We have a dogmatic theology and also the teaching of the Scripture, and this brings us back to Palestine and also to the Latin American world, no, not to the Latin, excuse me, to the Latin and Greek world, the world of the beginning. And we are called, in one sense, to become men of the first century, or perhaps also the second century after Christ, or also to become fellow countrymen of the Jews since Abraham until the birth of Jesus. No? You have biblical sciences and dogmatic theology. There is one pillar of theology. But the other pillar is pastoral theology. The way in which the event of Jesus is taking place today, in the history of the church, mainly in the history of the saints, and in the history of popular piety, the way in which the people live the event of Christ. And when I say the saints, I think of the great saints. By the way, Saint Francis was called by Tommaso da Celano, his first biographer, Alter Christus. With Francis, the event of Jesus happens again. But it happens again with every saint. And the saints are not only those who stand on the altars, the saints are the family mothers who have, and the family fathers and mothers who have constituted a family, a small church. In this family have given their lives in order that we could live, have educated us, and remain in the memory, not of the universal church, but yes, of their family. They enlarged the family when they have had many children. And this is the matter, the starting point of pastoral theology. And you must maintain a tension between the one and the other. Dogmatic theology enlightens pastoral theology. Dogmatic theology tells to pastoral theology sometimes you are wrong, you risk taking a wrong path. You risk creating a Jesus Christ on your own measure. And the true Jesus Christ breaks your measure, asks you conversion, that is, asks you to become different from what you have been up to now. But on the other hand, pastoral theology tells, dogmatic theology, this is the way in which the dogmatic truth becomes a living truth today for these people. If I can tell you a personal experience, I had the fortune of being in the circle of the friends of two great theologians, Anselm von Balthasar, I already quoted him, Joseph Ratzinger, and of a great pastoral theologian, Don Luigi Giussani. And it was really appalling to see how they discussed with one another. Giussani, who said, I am doing this, I am developing a movement that has these characteristics, and in this situation we think this is the right thing to do. And Balthasar and Ratzinger, who corrected him, or sometimes said, oh, I never thought this, but yes, it can be justified on the basis of the tradition of the church. Now, this is one fundamental aspect of liberation theology. It is a Latin American theology. If you want to make theology on a Latin American basis, and you enter into the life of the Latin American people, it is unavoidable to come to a shock with the phenomenon of poverty. Vast masses of people in Latin America are poor. Some of them are extremely poor. And their faith contains a demand for justice, for social change and for justice. Latin America stands in need of a revolution. How shall we find the method of this revolution? And the church cannot, if when you want to make a Latin American theology, you cannot put within brackets the horrible, terrible fact of people starving, of an enormous demand for social justice. What shall we do? And here you begin to have differences. One part of the Latin American church And this is the other pillar of liberation theology, the demand for social justice. And one part of the liberation theologians said, well, we need an instrument of social analysis. The event of Christ mobilizes energies. But in order to understand the world, the complicated world of today, we need an instrument of social analysis. And this instrument of social analysis is Marxism. And so you have the fact that liberation theology has these two pillars. The use of Marxism as an instrument of social analysis and the decision to begin with the faith experience of the Latin American people. This system did not find the agreement of all, because there is one point, one contradiction. Can we put together Christian faith of Marxism? Isn't Marxism an atheist philosophy? The answer that the liberation theologians used to give was, well, no, Marxism is not a philosophy. Marxism is a critical sociology. Fernando Cardoso, who happened to be later a good president of Brazil, developed what they call sociologia rebeldi, the critical sociology that coincided to a certain extent with Marxism, a Marxist critical sociology. Others that were philosophically more refined said, well, yes, but we must make a distinction within Marxism. In Marxism, you have a dialectical materialism, that is a philosophy, and of course it is materialist, it is incompatible with the Christian faith, but you have an historical materialism. Historical materialism, that is a method of social analysis. This is the situation in which Latin America was when John Paul II arrived. John Paul II said clearly one yes and one no. The yes was yes to a Latin American theology. How can he say yes to Latin American theology? I hope you have recognized in the description that I have given you of the fundamentals of Latin American theology and concrete application of Wojtyła's philosophy on the objective truth, knowledge, and consciousness. Consciousness does not create knowledge, but has to interiorize the objective knowledge, and in interiorizing the objective knowledge, it becomes, acquires a consistency of its own. So, to Wojtyła, the idea we need a Latin American theology was not at all something new. He did not develop really this in his philosophical works, yet not at the time of doing that. But if you read his homilies, the Polish homilies before becoming Pope and the Papa homilies after he became Pope, you find that he has, he has this capacity of seeing men in the concrete historical situation. What is the reason why he traveled so much? Because he wanted to encounter people in their cultural and historical situation. And if you consider the second pilgrimage of Wojtyła, the first was to Puebla, to Latin America. The second one was to his mother country. If you take the homily of Wojtyła in Warsaw on June 2nd, 1979, you find it is an homily on history. You cannot interpret, you cannot understand Polish history without the cross of Jesus Christ. Only in the light of this cross, this becomes an history of hope. So he taught that you had to have a Polish theology in one sense, as well as, I quoted yesterday, Józef Wierzyna, he taught that he had the task of developing the Czech theology. So why not a Latin American theology? Of course a Latin American theology. enthusiastic about the idea of a Latin American theology. Of course, with this tension and this balance of dogmatic theology and pastoral theology. Because another danger of liberation theology was a certain praxism. You must have theory and praxis, and theory and praxis must react with one another, and you cannot sever the theory, that is the dogmatic theology, leaving a praxis without a dogmatic orientation. So, yes to the first pillar, and no to the second pillar. It is difficult to explain this, but in 1978, the whole world was convinced that Marxism was the future of human culture. 10 years before, we had celebrated the first centenary of the publication of the Capital. And everybody was convinced that Marxism is the philosophy, the theory of the future. Well, not everybody. I imagine that here, nobody was convinced of this, and in Poland, equally. But in the West, it was widespread, this idea Marxism is the last cry of human culture. To Wojtyła, Marxism was already dead. The spiritual confrontation on man had already been lost. He had a vision that corresponds to a certain extent to that you can find in the booklet of Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless. What existed in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and so forth, was not a living culture. It was not even a totalitarian dictature. It was a post-totalitarian dictature in which people did not believe in anything, and the only belief was, since there is no truth, it is not worth the while to challenge power and to run risks to affirm a truth against power. And then power makes the truth, not the real truth, but the socially accepted truth. And so I said, no. Marxist analysis, no. What then, if not Marxist analysis, what is the instrument that we must have? And here the answer had two sides. One side was the Latin American people, they have a culture. The proletariat of Marx is a man who has lost any culture, who is indifferentiated, has no nationality, and through a kind of miracle, the Umwälzung, the turning upside down, the revolution will transform this completely isolated individual into a great society animated by a great solidarity. Communities created by the struggle. The necessity of the struggle is imposed by the crisis of capitalism. The capitalism did not have any crisis, and society was atomized, as well as in capitalist countries, or perhaps even more. And so, no, it is not the path. The Latin American poor has a culture. It is an analphabet culture, but it has a culture. A culture is the capacity of taking a stand in front of the fundamental facts of life, of interiorizing a specific way, of interiorizing the fundamental truth regarding human life. The fact of being born and of having parents and a family, sisters, brothers, the fact of having to work for those you love, the fact of falling in love, getting married, having children, the fact of death. Around these four fundamental events of your life, a culture is constituted. And the Latin American poor has a culture. And this culture is a Christian culture. It's a culture that has been tremendous, it's a culture whose form is the evangelization. So we must go back to the evangelization to find the culture of the Latin American poor. And in the center of this evangelization stands the event of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Unfortunately, we have not time to talk about Guadalupe, but there is one pillar of, let us say, the Neo-Latin American theology that begins with Wojtyła, with John Paul II. They have a culture. And this culture gives you also the rules of engagement of the struggle for liberation. In this struggle for liberation, you delve from this profound element contained in the culture of the Latin American people. And it is an element that has as a pillar the event of Guadalupe, but is sustained also through the great saints who have evangelized Latin America. Bartolomé de las Casas is not a saint, not yet a saint, at least not a saint who stands on the altars, but through Bartolomé de las Casas, through Mottolina, through Santo Toribio de Mongrovejo, a profound idea of justice and human dignity enters into the culture of the Latin American people, and this is the criterion of the struggle for liberation. Is that enough to understand a complex society like our own society? Of course, no. Can we use instruments that are given to us through modern social sciences? Of course. Even Marxist social sciences? Why not? The problem is that social sciences are not neutral. They imagine that they have been built upon the model of natural sciences. You remember what I said yesterday. There is a method of natural science, the science of pure objects, and there is a different methods to understand man. Social sciences always include a social philosophy. It may be explicit, it may be implicit, but in order to make use of social sciences for a project of liberation, you must apply to the social science a methodological correction. You must be aware of the philosophy that is contained in them, and you must correct this philosophy from the point of view of Christian anthropology, if you want to make theology. So, one yes and one no. How was it received in Latin America? And here you encounter Bergoglio, because there were many different receptions, many different ways of, well, generally it was a great success. Millions of people came to listen, and they recognized themselves in the words of the Pope. There was an encounter, a true encounter between John Paul II and the great masses of the Mexican people, and later of the other Latin American people when he went to visit them. How did the intellectuals react? How did the liberation theologians react? Some were completely against it. I don't know whether it is worth the while to make names, because perhaps these names are already forgotten, but I think mainly of Pablo Richards, Hugo Assmann, those of Central America. Some were, in the beginning, in doubt. The most famous name is Gustavo Gutierrez. And some were enthusiasts. The enthusiasts you find mainly in Argentina. In Argentina, also in Chile, in that part of America, of Latin America, that they call the Cono Sur. Uruguay, Argentina, Chile. You know, Latin America looks like an ice cream. Do you imagine how it is? And the cono is the part of Latin America that stands south. Why were, and I remember here, well, there are many, many of them were my friends. The most important of all was Alberto Metor Ferré. Alberto Metor Ferré is the philosopher and theologian who most influenced Jorge Mario Bergoglio. There was Lucio Gera, Juan Carlos Cannone, those who today are interested into the theology of the people, that is the theological background of Bergoglio, know Scannone. Scannone had been also a professor of Bergoglio when Bergoglio was in the seminar. There were some in Chile, very important, Pedro Morandé, who developed a wonderful sociology of the Latin American poor, perhaps the greatest Latin American sociologist of the second part of the 20th century. Hernan Alexandri, he died very young, but he was the most promising theologian. They were all enthusiastic about Puebla. To tell the whole truth, they had participated in the preparation of Puebla. Materials produced by them, they were united in the Equipo Teológico del CELAM, the theological team supporting the Bishops' Conference that had prepared Puebla. And their materials had been brought to knowledge to John Paul II. John Paul II wrote his speeches and homilies in a certain sense in dialogue with them. And among them, in a certain sense, the practical, the pastoral, not the theoretical, but the pastoral leader of the group was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Jorge Mario Bergoglio had been, in that moment, had been for a while the general of the Jesuits, no, the provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, but the Jesuits had hosted him out and had exiled him in San Miguel. San Miguel was the theological faculty of the Jesuits, so he was the rector of San Miguel. After a while, they will send him out of Argentina. They will send him to Germany to write a thesis on Guardini. Really, he loved Guardini, but he did not want to leave Argentina. But he obeyed and he went to Argentina for a while. But when I met him, he was in San Miguel. And around him, there was this group of theologians who were enthusiastic about John Paul II. They were not only theologians, they were also intellectuals, because Argentina had a situation that was, under certain aspects, similar to Poland. There was a military dictature, there was a struggle of the people for liberation, there were differences. In Argentina, there was a strong armed struggle that made use also of terrorist means. And Bergoglio, the country was split. There were the Montoneros, who had accepted the theory of Che Guevara on the guerrilla. There were the AAA, Alianza Anticomunista Argentina, the death squads, those who killed all those whom they suspected of being a leftist. And in the middle, there was a group that tried to avoid the civil war, struggled against the military dictature, but with pacific means, and they were targeted both by the Montoneros and by the AAA that wanted to compel them to take sides. I wish to remember here the name of Enrique Angelelli, Bishop of La Rioja. He was killed, more or less in the same period in which Popieusco was killed, and in a way that is astonishingly similar to Popieusco. They tried to disguise this as a car accident, just like they wanted with Popieusco. So in that situation, the people around Bergoglio had already developed the beginning of a theology that can be considered as a variation of liberation theology, the Argentinian brand of liberation theology. That's the definition that was given by Juan Carlos Scannone. But Bergoglio did not like the expression liberation theology. He preferred to say, we developed a theology of the people. And in the theology of the people, the role that in Marxiism is taken by the proletariat is taken by something different. The people. What is the people? The people is a specific way in which a group of men who share a common language, common traditions, have understood their humanity and created a culture. And in the case of Latin America, more often than not, a people arises through the evangelization. The evangelization creates a new people. It is not the same. You must not be schematic. There are other situations in which this can be a too simplified explanation. I don't know whether this holds true in Thailand. Who knows, perhaps, but I don't know. In Argentina, yes, there is literally true. In Latin America, this is literally true. Latin America arises through the mestizaje. It is the encounter of the Indios and the Spaniard, the conquerors and the conquered. And the Christian faith, the baptism, creates a bridge, allowed they to enter one in the life of the other. They got married. The idea that Spaniards had to get married to Indian women and take care of their children was not so uncontested in the beginning. They were the women of the conquered, and we take them and we leave them, and just like it happened in other situations. If you take the history of United States, in United States you see that there is a strong division, and the marriage between, with a few exceptions, but the marriage between the white and the colored, Indian or black, was not possible, was considered an abomination. In Latin America, no. Why? Because through Bartolomé de las Casas, through las leyes de las Indias of Charles V, through the evangelization, there was the recognition that the Indian is a man. Let's go back always to Borges, el otro, el mismo. And this creates a new culture, because if he is a man, I must change, enlarge, broaden the idea of humanity that I have. To recognize his humanity, I must change my understanding of my own humanity. And in this way, a people is created. And the people is not a thing. Bergoglio used to say that the people is a mythical reality. Sometimes people did not understand well and thought he wanted to say a mystical reality. No, a mythical reality. It is also a mystical reality in one sense, but it is, first of all, a mythical reality. A mythical reality is something that does not exist as an object. A people arises in the act of the interiorization of a certain truth in a specific culture. So you see how the philosophy of Wojtyła and the elaboration that had been created by the Argentinians were immediately in contact with one another. They had already discovered that, well, for a while, some of them had been militants in the movement Curas para el Tercer Mundo, priests for the third world. That was one of the roots also of the other theology of liberation. But they had already discovered that Marxism was not the way, and had tried to develop a vision of their own. A vision based on the idea of people and the idea of a struggle oriented to the liberation of the people. In this, you find the preferential choice for the poor. It is not something, the preferential choice for the poor is not something that is something that arises out of compassion also, but not mainly. In the case of the Argentinian people, in the case of the Latin American people, this process of interiorization of certain values in a specific cultural form is dramatically influenced by the presence of Christianity. What does this mean? Jesus Christ is a Son of God and is a man. As a man, there's another side of the philosophy of evolution, by the way, that yesterday you could not explain. Men, human persons, are made in a particular way. They are empty. Empty in the sense that each person can accept within herself or within himself other human beings. Man is always in a relation to others. Since when I am born in a relation to my mother, and to a lesser extent also to my father, and to my sisters and brothers. And later, my life grows in the relation with other human beings. Other human beings enter into my life. In this way, other human beings entered into the life of Jesus Christ. And Jesus gave them the capacity of becoming an instrument to allow all those whom they met to enter in the life of Jesus, and therefore in the life of God, since Jesus is the Son of God. This creates a peculiar kind of personality. A Christian personality is a communional personality. It's a personality that creates, that experiences an ontological change. But, and this is, well, sacramental theology, the novelty of the Argentinians and of Wojtyła was, and also of Don Luigi Giussani, who had a certain influence through a couple of his friends in the Argentinian events, is to think that this ontological change must be reflected into a sociological change. The communal personality is the personality of a man who constructs communities. The Christian community is the expression towards the outside of the new ontological structure of the Christian personality. And to create community means, in the long run, to create a people. In this sense, the people is something that stands in a close connection with the reality of the church. In one sense, the people is the church that becomes human flesh and blood. Only in one sense, because of course, you must take into account the fact that not all those who participate in the life of the people are Christians. But nevertheless, the Christians construct a community and give a strong impulse to the experience of becoming one, of many becoming one. Take United States. The motto of United States, a pluribus unum. A pluribus means a lot of people who are not Christians. But this idea that many can become one arises out of Christianity. Is the political transposition or the social transposition of the Christian idea of communion. So if you want to understand the roots of the Latin American people, if you want to understand the roots of the Argentinian people, you must recognize that there is an Eucharistic meaning on an Eucharistic dimension in the idea of people. Although, of course, when this becomes flesh, it must be open to accept that other people who are not Christian enter into the same civil community. If this is true, the existence of the poor is a flagrant contradiction, is a scandal. If in my family one daughter is poor and does not have what is needed for life, this implies that I have betrayed her, that it is not true that I say that I have a communal personality. She is not allowed to enter into my personality, my person. It is the idea of common good. The common good is not the gross national product. It's not a sum of the individual goods of all the persons. No, the common good arises, first of all, includes all of this, but first of all, The idea of common good arises out of the fact that you are a good for me. And I cannot happy if you are unhappy. Let us make again the example of the family. When I define my good, can I define my good without taking into account the good of my wife and of my children? I cannot. And this same dynamism takes place in the life of the people. If some of the people of us live in conditions of abject poverty, this means that all what we say about our nation is an ideology. It is not true. It is not true that we have a communal personality. It is not true that we have created a community. It is a scandal. Poverty is a scandal. And in this way, the theology of the people assumes the idea of the preferential choice for the people, and also the idea of a revolution, although in a specific way. And here, I must quote again Alberto Metol, who was strongly influenced by a couple of Italian philosophers who were his friends. One of them was Augusto del Noce. Let's come to Europe now for a while. What is the idea of revolution? Philosophically, the idea of revolution begins with the French Revolution. We speak of an American Revolution, of an English Revolution, but they are different revolutions. If you take the English Revolution, for instance, it is based on the idea that there are some values contained in English history, and the king has betrayed these values, attempting to create a despotic regime, and the nation has rebelled against the king, who was betraying the true English tradition. In the glorious revolution of 1689, the revolution of 1648, 44, excuse me, 1648, the first English revolution, is somewhat different, more complicated. But the glorious revolution of 1689 is a revolution in the name of tradition. And if you read the Declaration of Independence of the United States, you see that it is a revindication of original rights. The French Revolution is not the same. The French Revolution implies a complete break between the past and the new reality. The new reality arises not out of an historical experience, an historical growth. The new reality arises out of the fact that we have discovered a science, an use of reason that allows us to project and to realize a new society according to reason. And this is linked to the idea that we apply the methods of natural sciences to human society. The great critic of the French Revolution was Joseph de Maistre. He considered the revolution as a demoniac event. Why demoniac? Because it breaks the tradition. And the church, Christianity and so forth, they belong to a past that has to be annihilated. This is one aspect of the Maistre. Another aspect of the Maistre is that this event that has its roots in hell and the devil, nevertheless, is also a just punishment for the Ancien regime, because they had betrayed those values. The revolution could triumph because the Ancien regime, the ruling classes, the nobility, the king, had betrayed the true values of Christian tradition. And then arises the idea of restoration. This was very important in Latin America, because in Latin America you have had a lot of movements in the church also, who are animated by the idea of the restoration of the Christian order, the restoration of the Christian society. The last one, the most famous perhaps, is the TFP, the Tradição, Família e Propriedade, who are now making a great mess about the Synod of the Amazonas, by the way. It was the idea of counter-revolution, of reaction against the revolution. But in the Mestre, there was also another side that these reactionaries do not see. This is a sentence that I take from his most important book, Les Considérations sur la France. A counter-revolution is the contrary of a revolution. It's not a revolution with the opposite sign. What does this mean? The idea of counter-revolution in the Mestre was not the idea, now we make a Christian revolution, we kill all the revolutionaries, and we reinstate the social forms of the past. It was the idea that we recreate the continuity of tradition. And this idea that in the Mestre is only a small part in his philosophy, was later developed by a great Italian philosopher, Antonio Rosmini, who, by the way, has become a saint. And Rosmini has created the idea of risorgimento. Risorgimento is a revolution in the name of the values of the Christian tradition that have been betrayed and are reinstated. And the values do not correspond to the social forms. There was a certain medievalism in the Catholic Church, a certain nostalgia of the past. And Rosmini anticipated Wojtyła with the idea of the modality of rights, the modality of values. The modality is the way in which those values are actual today. And in order to preserve the values, you have to change the social forms. So you cannot think of a restoration of the social forms of the Middle Ages or of yesterday. You have no more this nostalgia of the past. Christians who are oriented towards the past and want to reinstate the conditions of the past. You have rather the idea we have to discover the new modalities that are the modalities in our time of the values that are values forever. Based on this, Alberto Mettolferré formulated, excuse me, I am moving, I am a little bit too passionate and then I switch to Spanish. Alberto Mettolferré formulated the idea of el resurgimiento católico latinoamericano. Latin America needs a revolution. This revolution must be a resurrection of the original values of the evangelization of Latin America, and it must be Catholic, and it must have modalities that are different from those of the Marxist revolution. Now you understand also the reason why they refused violence. Under the most terrible oppression, they refused to make use of violence, and they always used a method of struggle that made an appeal to the conscience of the oppressor. By the way, this was very similar to what you were doing here with Carta 77, the Polish people were doing with Solidarność. And I remember I used to travel from Central Europe to Latin America, to Argentina, and they were extremely interested in Carta 77, in Solidarność, and they consider it, in one sense, as brothers in the same struggle. And their hope was to create, in different ways, of course, very different ways, but in the periphery of the empire of the United States, something similar to what you were doing in the periphery of the Soviet Empire. Now, this has been in Latin America what we might call the continuation of Puebla. Puebla has given the direction. Those who have struggled to continue Puebla and not to let Puebla die were mainly these people of the Teología del Pueblo. And their spiritual leader was Bergoglio. He had been hosted by the Jesuits. By the way, when Argentina was torn apart by the Civil War, the Jesuits were torn apart also. And he tried to keep them together. And this is the reason why, in the end, they did not want him. And they sent him back, they sent him to Europe. In the time of his greatest isolation, the Archbishop Antonio Guarracino, who had been the Secretary General of Chelem at the time of Puebla, became Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And he wanted him as his auxiliary bishop. And he became the successor of Guarracino. And he has been the leader of the Latin American Church on the route that goes from Puebla up to Aparecida. Aparecida is the fifth General Conference of Latin American Epistolate. In Aparecida, you find the mature formulation of a theology of the people that is not the liberation theology, although it contains in itself many elements of the liberation theology. Fundamentally, the idea of a theology that is incarnated in the life of the people. I do not resist the temptation of adding one point. We would need a long time to explain this. But there is one interesting fact you must know. Imagine Mexico in 1518, 1519, 1520, 1521. The Spaniards have conquered. They've killed a lot of people. There is a tremendous alteration in the life of the people. The Aztecs, the Mesoamerican cultures, more broadly, had the idea that the sun was threatened by the power of darkness. Who gives you the guarantee every day when the sun sets down that it will rise up again tomorrow? Whence comes the strength that allows the sun to win the battle against the shadows? This strength comes from the human blood. The human sacrifices are necessary in order to give to the sun the strength to rise and in order to preserve the world order. Now, we are not making any human sacrifices anymore. Our symbolic world has collapsed, and men need to have a symbolic world. It was the way in which they interiorized some fundamental values, mixed up with some fundamental disvalues. And a lot of people died. People did not till the land. Women did not took care of their children. They abandoned their children when they were born. They let themselves die. There is a tremendous poem written by a group of their intellectuals that says, our gods are dead, let us die. And really, there was a terrible scarcity, and can you imagine the evangelization under those conditions? We, the Spaniards, come and tell to you you whom we have killed culturally and in many cases also materially, that Jesus Christ is the Savior. How can you imagine that? And of course, the evangelization was not a success. It was a disaster. There were some very good priests who tried desperately, defending the Indians against the Spaniards also. But nevertheless, the results were very poor. And then, in 1531, on Tepehuac, near to Mexico, a lady appears to a young man called Juan Diego, and she says to him, I am the Virgin Mother of God. And this lady is a Mesoamerican lady, dressed according to the custom with with a lot of symbolic elements in her dressing, and she wants a basilica to be built in the place of the apparition. The basilica is built, and in the course of a few years, millions and millions of Mexicans convert, and life begins again. And this Virgin is the Virgin Mary. She has the cross. But on the other hand, she represents very closely an Aztec divinity. In one sense, the Virgin starts the evangelization, taking the culture of the Aztecs, purifying it from the anti-Christian elements, and leading it to the encounter with Christianity. It was 1531. In a few years, we are having the 5th centenary of the apparition of Tepeyac, and Pope Francis thinks that this is the good occasion to continue and bring to a new stage the process of the construction of the new Latin American pastoral. We are initiating, not right now, we will initiate in a couple of years, a great novena of preparation to the commemoration of this anniversary. And it is the anniversary of the apparition of the Virgin, but also in these 9 years we want to open a search for Latin American identity. What does it really mean to be a Latin American? And what is the contribution that Latin America has to give today to the culture of the church? Because a matrix church, a matrix theology, must always be in relation to the greater theology of the Catholic Church, must understand itself as a contribution to the developing of the theology of the Catholic Church in an age that is the age of globalization. And globalization implies the reconciliation of many peoples who have done terrible things against one another. It must be an age of forgiveness, and it must be an age of reciprocal understanding, in which, if possible, also in the level of the ecumene, something takes place that resembles the dynamism of the church. Different churches, different cultures, that are the expression of a same fundamental experience of encounter with God in Jesus through Mary. And, now I hope you understand why, against many, I defend the idea of a fundamental continuity between Wojtyła and Bergoglio. Bergoglio was the man of Wojtyła in Latin America. And he developed, enlarged the idea of Wojtyła that you encounter man in his culture, or in her culture. And that the church must become flesh and blood in the life of the nations. Wojtyła uses rather the word nation, narod. Bergoglio speaks of people, and there are many reasons for this difference that is not devoid of any meaning. But nevertheless, fundamentally, it is the same thing. It is the idea of a living church that is interiorized and is the source of original expressions in different human culture. And this is also an idea of the pastoral of the church, not to stay out of society, but to animate society from within, not to constitute a reactionary party that wants to go back to the past, but also not to accept a liquid society in which man is not understood as a member of a community, to struggle against the reduction of man either to being only a member of a community or to being only an individual. A community is a putting together that takes place through the liberty of man and not through an external compulsion. I think we are living in an interesting period of the history of the Church. I don't know whether I should stop here, because if I go on, I need some 20 minutes more because I must enter into a new stage. Thank you for the patience with which you have listened to me.